How many people here ski? Not bad. I had a conversation with somebody this week who's a longtime skier, and it brought to mind my first days of learning how to ski, which weren't as graceful as I'd hoped they would have been. I was a young man who was relatively athletic, and I thought, therefore, that I would take to it relatively easily, but I had the hardest time getting on the chairlift. I don't know of you, any of you who ski, or those of you who have watched people ski, there is a moment when you're getting on the ski chairlift that you have to make the decision to sit down. And it's almost an act of faith, because your feet are planted into these very long skis, and if you don't sit down at the exact right moment, you can get hit by the chair and knocked over. And if that happens, your face ends up in the snow and your skis get stuck as well, and you can't get out. Now the opposite can happen as well, and that is you can sit down too early, which is equally as embarrassing and infinitely more painful, because if you sit too early, you're going to get hit by that chair in the head. Now, as difficult as it is to get on the chairlift, getting off is worse. You've now had this wonderful moment of sitting with the air blowing through your hair. And then it's time to get off the chairlift. And what most people do is this is a technical term, they scooch forward. And then you have to make the decision when you're going to stand up. Because if you get up too early, you'll miss the ground because it's not there yet. But if you go to get off too late, it's worse, because you end up going around again. And then you have that wonderful experience of hair and the air blowing through it. There is an exact moment to do something. It's true of getting on the ski lift and getting off the ski lift, but it's equally as important when you're sitting at a traffic light. I don't know why people are so impatient at a traffic light. I know I am one of the most patient people I know. I know that when I sit at a traffic light and it turns green and the person in front of me doesn't move immediately, what I do is I take a breath. And I say they'll move in their own time. Of course, I don't understand when I'm the first one at the light why people are so anxious for me to move. I'm deep in thought. I'm solving world problems. And they're honking at me for not moving fast enough. Because just like the ski lift and the traffic light, there is a perfect time for everything. There is a time to be born and a time to die, says Ecclesiastes. A time to sow and a time to reap. We know that there are exact right moments for everything under the sun. And we recognize that sometimes we're late and sometimes we're early. But if you're too late, you miss the boat. It reminds me of a cartoon that I once saw of two dinosaurs standing on a rock looking out at Noah's Ark. And one dinosaur turns to the other and says, "Oh, was that today?" If you're too late, you miss the boat. And if you miss the boat, sometimes you miss the opportunity. And sometimes you're placed in the exact right location at the exact right time because it's your moment. That's what Leo's doing here today. It's his moment. He worked for today. Had he gotten the date wrong, we would have been here without him. But he arrived exactly at the right moment and executed his skills beautifully because he had spent the time in preparation. And so we know it's not just the arrival at the right time, but being able to do what's called upon you at that moment. So I'm always left with the question, what are you waiting for? If you have arrived at the right moment, the position and the opportunity has presented itself, there's always a thought in the back of your mind of reluctance. And so you have to ask yourself the question that we ask ourselves all the time as people living in this world, what are you waiting for? There is so much wrong with our world. There are so many problems that befall us and face us. So we have to ask ourselves the question, what are we waiting for? Does the ship have to leave? Does the train have to exit the station before we recognize we've missed it? What are we waiting for? This morning's Parsha presents just such a moment. Let me read it to you. Vayomar biladichem et ha'ivriot uritem et avanim im benhu vamitem otam v'im bathi v'chaya. Pharaoh has issued a decree that all male children are to be put to death, while all females will be permitted to live. And 2 midwives, 2 of the few people who are named in this morning's Parsha, Shifra and Puah. The text says, Vayar b'sivlotam, they saw their suffering. And you know what they did. They said, we can't do it. In the face of an all-powerful Pharaoh who has issued an edict, a decree among the whole land, that this will go forth. No more Jewish men will survive. These 2 women said, I'm sorry. I can't wait anymore. I'll deliver the Moses to the Jewish people. These 2 women, in the face of an all-powerful leadership, said, Vayar b'sivlotam. They saw what was going on. And instead of responding, I'm afraid of what's going to happen to me if I disobey Pharaoh, they could hear in the back of their voices, in the back of their minds, the voices that said, Vayar b'sivlotam. They saw their suffering, and they didn't wait anymore. They didn't pause and say, what should I do? They answered the question, what are you waiting for? With, I'm here, I'm now, I'm going to do something. I'm present for the Jewish people. And because of them, we survived. The Or HaChaim says, Tzarich ladat la'ize inyan re'iyazo. The Or HaChaim says, we have to explore, what does this seeing really mean? What was it that Shifra and Puah saw that forced them to act? Od tzarich ladat tamu lama lo gazar alako. They said Pharaoh wasn't in charge of everybody, though he thought he was. Shifra and Puah say, he's not in charge of me. You know, my kids say that all the time, right? You're not the boss of me. Little do they know. Ve'ein lahamin alav, says the Or HaChaim. They didn't believe in Pharaoh. They believed in God. Ki midat rachamim nahag lashum lahem she'erit ba'aretz. And it was on them to show compassion in the face of tyranny and allow the Jewish people to survive, to gather up the remnants of what could be put together from this people decimated by bondage and slavery, forced into submission by oppression and viciousness. Vayar b'sivlotam. They saw the suffering. And then the same exact words are heard again later, 1 chapter later. Moses, says the text, Vayhi bayamim hahem vayigdal Moshe. In those days, Moses grew up. An incredible statement in and of itself. What does it mean for us to grow up? Vayigdal Moshe vayetze el Achav, and he went out to his people. Vayar besivlotam, and Moses saw their suffering. Vayar ish mitzri makeh et ivri me'achav. He saw an Egyptian taskmaster beating a Jew. Vayar besivlotam, the text says, he saw their suffering. And while the maidservants, the midwives, were afraid and acted, Moses was the one who acted and then was afraid. Let me remind you the story. Moses kills this Egyptian taskmaster. Later, he realizes that two people had seen him do this act, and he was afraid that he'd get turned in. And so he acted first and then was afraid. Shifra and Puah were afraid and then they acted. So put these two stories next to each other and you say to yourself, what was the impetus for action in their lives? Some of us act because we're afraid. Some of us act because we're not afraid. Says the text of the Torah, it doesn't matter what drives you to do something right. It doesn't matter if you're acting out of fear or because of injustice. What matters, vayar besivlotam, that you see suffering and act to alleviate it. Rashi, one of the great commentaries on that text, says the following: Vayar besivlotam, he saw their suffering. Natan einav v'libo lihiyot beitzar alehem. Rashi says he didn't see their suffering; he felt their suffering. He didn't see with his eyes; he felt with his heart, and that was the difference. The message either way is exactly the same. It doesn't matter what motivates you. It doesn't matter if you're afraid or you have extraordinary courage. It doesn't matter if you understand or you don't identify at all. Once you see suffering, you have to do something. No matter how grand a scale or how small it is, you must act in your life. When you see suffering, whether it's a small child who has lost hold of their father's hand for a moment and is crying, and you have the capacity to put those two together, or you see widespread poverty, you are required to act. Vayar besivlotam, when you see suffering, no matter how great or how small, you are required to act. You don't get the option of saying, I'm just an innocent bystander. You don't get the option to say to yourself, I'm going to look away. Vayar besivlotam, once you see suffering, it becomes a part of you. And the only way to extricate it is to do something. Moses sees a fellow human being being beat, and he does something. Shifra and Puah see the horrific decree of Pharaoh, and no matter how afraid they might have been, they did something. I would imagine that each and every one of us can think of an example, can think of a moment where we saw suffering and did nothing. Now is the opportunity to say to yourself, I change. When I see suffering, I'm going to do something. No matter how simple a gesture it can be. It might be a hug. It might be a call. It might be a card. It might be an invitation for a cup of tea. Vayar besivlotam, when you see suffering, alleviate it. Do something to make this world a kinder, gentler place. In this world of rampant anger and polarization, we have to be radically open. Detiftach libi bioraita. We have to open our hearts. We have to pry our hearts open because we've become numb to the pain in the world. We have no choice at this moment, at this station in history, to open our hearts when all we want to do is hide behind our walls. When all we want to do is put up guards, we have to let down our guard and be radically open to loving those people around us. Shabbat Shalom. We continue with Musaf, page 184. Please rise.